The American Revolution is also known as the American Revolutionary War and the U.S. War of Independence. This conflict was a result of growing tensions between the colonists living in the 13 colonies and the British Crown. The British created these tensions by passing many bills and laws that the colonists felt were violating their natural rights as British citizens. British citizens have the right to tax themselves. Therefore, the colonists thought that only their own colonial assemblies should be able to pass their taxes. When Parliament continued to pass more and more laws, such as the Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and Towns and Duty Acts, the colonists grew more and more upset. It is important to understand that the colonists were not angry that they had to pay the actual tax, as they were lower than the taxes in Britain. The colonists were angry at their denied access to a self-government. At first, independence was not a widespread idea. However, after the publication of several documents such as Thomas Paine's Common Sense, the colonists became more infuriated. Many people who were undecided, or thought that there was still a chance for reconciliation with Britain, were convinced that independence was their only option. This was especially shown after King George rejected the Olive Branch Petition. Once it became apparent that it was absolutely necessary to break the bonds with Britain, many events succeeded. After the meeting of the Second Continental Congress, the colonial militia became an officially funded army, the Continental Army. The army had early success at battles such as Bunker Hill and Concord. They later hit harder times, but eventually pulled through. They beat the largest and most powerful military force in the world, leading them to gain their independence. However, independence never would have been possible if it wasn't for the women of this time. Women took on many roles to achieve independence, playing a critical role in the success of the war. Some of these roles were traditional, while others were quite scandalous for the time. From going door to door to get other women to agree to a boycott of British goods, to supporting roles such as nurses, cooks, and maids, to more direct roles such as secret soldiers and spies, women were the behind-the-scenes work that made this war a success. These women, sometimes known as the Daughters of Liberty, did more than anyone had suspected and helped gain America its independence. Established in 1765, the Daughters of Liberty were a successful colonial American group consisting of women who showed their loyalty by participating in events such as boycotts of British goods. They refused to drink British tea and used their skills to weave their own cloth materials, making America less dependent on British textiles. The Daughters of Liberty proved that women could successfully be involved in politics. They helped to popularize ideas of rebellion and resistance. They signed agreements and pledges, swearing their allegiance to the Patriots and gaining support for the movement. Although nurses were not frequently used in the early days of the war, they became more necessary in 1777. According to the book, The Revolutionary War, many nurses were originally family members of soldiers, wives, daughters, and mothers who followed the war because they had struggled to support themselves at home after the men had left to go fight. While surgeons did most of the skilled medical duties, the work that the women performed was just as important, as it usually involved patient care. Women did mostly custodial work, feeding and bathing patients, emptying chamber pots, cleaning hospital wards, and cooking. None of this was pleasant work, but it was these essential actions that most people take for granted. According to the book, It's Our Military Too, women often came up with new inventions to help treat and care for patients. Becoming a nurse was a risky job. The mortality rate in hospitals for the sick, as well as the caregivers, was exceptionally high. However, the job offered food and pay, and many were brave enough to give their service despite the risks. Mary Waters was an important nurse in the war. She was a Dublin native who immigrated to Philadelphia and became an army nurse after the war broke out. She was on the verge of abandoning her profession of medicine when she was convinced to become a revolutionary nurse by Ferdinand Farmer. During the war, she worked tirelessly in hospitals for the American Army, earning the praise of one of the prominent patriots, Dr. Benjamin Rush. Another famous nurse was Mary Priestley, who served as a nurse on colonial warships, such as the ship the Defense in 1777. Priestley was one of only 4 nurses on the ship who were responsible for caring for over 100 wounded soldiers. Employment as a revolutionary nurse was a demanding, harsh, and risky job, but it is one that the war could not have been a success without. More popular occupations for women during the war were seamstresses, cooks, and maids. These, among laundresses and water bearers, were the first time that women held these positions in the military, as they were usually reserved for male soldiers. Just like with the nurses, many of these women were poor wives, daughters, and mothers who followed the soldiers. Since most of these women were accustomed to doing housework anyways, they were well suited for the positions. An example of one of these women was Margaret Corbin of Philadelphia. She followed her husband, John Corbin, to the army where he enlisted in the 1st Company of the Pennsylvania Artillery as a maîtresse, someone who loads and fires cannons. During the Battle of Fort Washington in November of 1776, Margaret was with her husband on the battlefield when he was suddenly killed. Because the cannon was then unmanned, Margaret took the cannon and continued firing until she was injured herself. The colonists lost the battle, but continued to make progress. Corbin became the first woman to earn a pension for her service in the Revolutionary War. She inspired many other women to take part in the struggle for independence. Women like Margaret, who stood up to the challenge and stepped in when they were needed, were critical points in the war. According to Major Problems in the Era of the American Revolution, 1760 to 1791, edited by Richard D. Brown on page 297, patriots were skeptical about giving women official status in the Army. Washington objected to a fixed quota of women, but the women followed nevertheless. Many women served as secret soldiers. These female soldiers generally disguised themselves by cutting their hair, binding their breasts with bandages, and adopting masculine names. The reasons for doing this varied, but most women related to young, poor, unmarried women who joined to earn money for their families or just to have the opportunity to fight for America's independence. Some famous female soldiers include Deborah Sampson from Massachusetts, who fought under the alias Robert Shirtliff in 1781 and served for over a year before being discovered, and Anne Bailey of Boston, who enlisted in 1777 under the alias Sam Gay and was promoted to corporal before her identity was discovered just weeks later, leading to her arrest and imprisonment. After her release, Bailey signed up and served as a soldier again. Many women were amazing leaders in the Army, leading men to victories. Some women took on even riskier roles during the war and became spies. It is not known exactly how many women participated. According to the National Women's History Museum website, most female spies worked as cooks and maids for the British military camps, where they eavesdropped on conversations about troop movements, military plans, supply shortages, and deliveries. Because the war was fought on farms, city streets, and the front of many American homes, women spies were easily able to carry the information back without detection. Not much is known about the women spies of Massachusetts because they did not have a central spy system during the Siege of Boston like they did later on in New York. This lack of organization helped to make it harder for women spies to be caught. When the war moved to New York, the Army set up the Culper Spy Ring and created the spy name 335 specifically for women spies working within the ring. One famous female revolutionary spy was Hannah Blair, a Quaker from North Carolina. Blair had a farm where she would hide and protect patriots, supplied food and medical help to revolutionary soldiers hiding in the woods from loyalist raiders, mended uniforms, and carried secret messages. When the Loyalists discovered what she was doing, they burned down her farm. However, after the war, Congress compensated her for her loss by giving her a pension for her service. It was not only men who risked their lives for independence. Women played a large role during the war. Clothing and other materials were needed to clothe Patriot soldiers, so women got together to spin and sew uniforms. When militias appealed to the public for uniforms and food, homespun garments and farm crops came from patriotic women. Women stepped forward to fill holes left by wounded or killed soldiers and performed tasks that were formerly left only for men, such as farming and running a business. Many men would have returned to bankruptcy after the war had it not been for the efforts of their wives. Without women, male soldiers would not have the necessary amounts of clothes or food, reinforcements, and secret information during the fighting. Not only would they have lost the war, they would have left the economy in a broken state. Some of these women were recognized for their service with pensions and pay. A few, such as Deborah Sampson, even wrote memoirs about their service. Still, many were never rewarded for the sacrifices they made towards American independence, including their lives. These women took on many selfless roles to achieve independence, risking everything, and were the central reason that the war was a success and Americans have freedom today.